Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming steadily on the windshield of the black sedan parked outside the Capitol Hotel. Streetlights flickered through the water-soaked air, painting distorted amber halos across the slick pavement. Inside the car, Thorne, Celeste Monroe's security aide, adjusted the collar of his coat. "I'll wait here," he said, glancing toward the hotel entrance. "You've got your umbrella?" Celeste, dressed in a slate-gray trench coat and low heels, nodded and stepped out. She had always preferred to walk alone for a few minutes after long meetings, time to clear her mind, to feel the night, to breathe freely. Her heels clicked softly against the sidewalk as she made her way through the quiet street. Just a few blocks to her temporary residence. She thought. The rain, though inconvenient, was almost comforting. She turned the corner of 10th and Monroe, a bitter irony, considering her last name, when the screech of tires sliced through the silence. A patrol car, white and blue, pulled up sharply beside her. "Hey," a voice barked. Celeste froze. She turned slowly, blinking into the high beams as a man stepped out. He was white, tall, with a hard jaw and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had been taught that the badge on his chest gave him the right to dominate. "Officer Derek Klein, what are you doing out here?" he demanded. "I'm walking," Celeste said evenly, her voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You match the description of a suspect," he said, voice clipped. "Where you headed?" She narrowed her eyes. "I'm going home, and I haven't heard of any suspect reports." "What description would that be?" "Female, black, long coat," he said without hesitation. "That's not a description. That's a demographic," she replied, her tone still composed. Derek's eyes flickered with something ugly. He stepped closer. "Let me see some ID. I'm not legally required to show you anything unless I'm being detained," Celeste replied, her heart rate rising but her voice steady. That was the moment Derek snapped. "You want to play smart?" he hissed. "Turn around." Before she could respond, he seized her arm roughly, twisted it behind her back, and slammed her onto the hood of the patrol car. "You're resisting arrest," he snarled, yanking out handcuffs. "I am not resisting anything," she cried. "You're violating protocol." The metal cuffs bit into her wrists. "You people never learn," he muttered under his breath, and shoved her into the back of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, the sound echoed through the street like a verdict. Celeste Monroe, United States Senator, sat in the backseat of a police cruiser, hands cuffed, rain streaking the windows, and nobody knew where she was. Yet, the holding room smelled of bleach, metal, and humiliation. Celeste sat alone on a hard bench, wrists red and sore, trench coat soaked and clinging to her like a second skin. She had not been read her rights. She had not been allowed to make a phone call. Her ID, snatched from her purse without permission, lay discarded on the metal table outside the glass partition. A clock on the wall ticked, agonizingly slow. 3 hours. She had been held for 3 hours without cause. A female officer had walked by earlier, glanced through the glass, and paused. Something shifted in her face. Recognition, disbelief, then concern. She had vanished quickly. Celeste suspected that wheels were now turning, quietly. Behind the scenes. At hour 4, the door burst open. A man in a dark suit, red tie loosened at the collar, entered, pale with panic. "Senator Monroe," he said breathlessly. "I'm Chief Rollins. I can't express how deeply sorry we are." Celeste said nothing. "Officer Klein did not realize who you were," he continued, trying to smile, as though this could all be smoothed over like a wrinkle in a tablecloth. She finally spoke. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Her voice was low, steady, lethal. "You only care because of who I am." He looked down. "We're releasing you immediately. Your vehicle is waiting outside. The mayor is ready to issue a formal apology. Internal Affairs is. I don't want a private apology," she said coldly. "I want a public reckoning." The room went silent. Even the clock seemed to stop. Then, slowly, she stood, her posture regal, the cuffs now gone, but the wounds still fresh. "Don't forget this moment, Chief." "I won't." By morning, the story had spread like wildfire. First, a whisper on Twitter. Black woman arrested in D.C. for walking in the rain. Sources say she's someone important. Then, a leak. Senator Celeste Monroe was detained without cause by local police. A clip from a bystander's cell phone showed the arrest in grainy detail. The audio was muffled, but the roughness of Officer Klein's handling was unmistakable. Moments later, footage from the squad car's internal camera emerged. He was heard calling her uppity and dangerous, before mocking her for thinking she's someone special. She was someone special, and the world was about to find out just how much. By noon, the hashtag justice for Celeste trended worldwide. Cable news anchors replayed the footage, zoomed in on her face as she sat calmly in the backseat, gaze unbroken despite the rain. Protests broke out in Baltimore, Chicago, Atlanta. Civil rights attorneys called for the immediate termination and arrest of Officer Klein. Meanwhile, Klein had gone into hiding. His name and badge number had been posted online. His personal Facebook page, filled with pro-gun memes and anti-immigrant rants, became evidence. At a press conference that afternoon, Celeste appeared before the cameras. Her hair was tied back, her expression resolute. I was detained, cuffed, and humiliated, not because I broke the law, but because a man with a badge saw a black woman walking alone at night and assumed the worst. She let the words hang in the air. I am not the first, and I will not be the last. But I promise you, this ends here. Baltimore always looked the same when she returned. The cracked sidewalks, the old corner store where she used to buy peanut brittle with her father, the house with the broken shutters her mother still refused to fix. Celeste stepped out of the black SUV, her heels clicking against pavement made familiar by childhood. Her mother, strong and silver-haired, stood in the doorway. Girl, she murmured, arms folding her tight. You all right? Celeste breathed in her scent, lavender and resilience. I'm okay, Mama, she whispered. I'm just tired. Inside, the kettle sang softly on the stove. They sat in the kitchen, old photographs lining the walls. One of her father in his work uniform, one of Celeste at her high school graduation, one of the three of them together, smiling in a world that no longer existed. You remember the night your father was taken? Her mother asked quietly. Celeste nodded, eyes distant. He went to the corner store. Man said he looked suspicious. Cops beat him, said he resisted. He came home with a black eye and a broken rib. He never smiled the same again. They sat in silence. I didn't speak up then. Her mother said, I was scared. We all were. But you've got that fire. Celeste's hands curled around her cup of tea. He was the reason I went to law school. And now, this. You turn your pain into purpose. Her mother said, that's what we do. Celeste looked out the window. She had come a long way from the girl on Monroe Street, but the street had followed her. And now, it was time to make it answer for everything it had taken. The city did not sleep. By the second night after the incident, crowds had gathered in Lafayette Square, candles flickering beneath protest signs that read, We are Celeste, and walking while black is not a crime. The steps of Capitol Hill were blanketed with flowers, letters, and photographs, tributes not just to Celeste Monroe, but to generations of black men and women whose stories had never reached a microphone. News vans formed a wall outside the D.C. Metropolitan Police Headquarters. Anchor after anchor recited the events with carefully measured outrage. Analysts dissected every second of the video footage, every word from Officer Derek Klein's mouth, every inch of Celeste's posture. Was she resisting? No. Was she complying? Yes. Had she been threatened? Clearly. And yet, as public anger grew, so did the silence from those in power. The mayor released a statement calling the incident regrettable. The chief of police promised an internal review. Derek Klein, according to early reports, had followed standard procedures based on the information available at the time. Celeste knew what that meant. They were hoping it would blow over. She had no intention of letting it. That afternoon, she walked into her Senate office to find the hallway lined with letters from supporters, flowers delivered by strangers, and reporters waiting on every floor. Her staff looked exhausted but determined. Her communications director, a whip-smart woman named Tasha Evers, held up her phone. CNN wants you live at 8. Trevor knows people called. You got a breakfast slot on Good Morning America. I'll do them all, Celeste said, already unbuttoning her coat. This isn't about me anymore. What is it about, Senator? Tasha asked. Celeste turned, voice quiet but cutting. It's about proving that one badge can't erase a person's dignity. It's about not going quietly into the same darkness my father did. That night, she went live on national television. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with clarity. She didn't demand vengeance. She demanded transformation. And as the country listened, a movement began, not in shouting, not in flames, but in truth. While the country chanted her name, Derek Klein sat in the shadows of his brother's guest room in Alexandria. Curtains drawn, phone turned off. His face was plastered across television screens, newspapers, and digital timelines, framed with phrases like racist cop, abuser of power, and face of modern policing. He didn't understand what had gone wrong. He had done what he always did, followed his gut. That woman, that night, looked suspicious. She looked like she didn't belong in that neighborhood. Dressed too well, walking too confidently. It wasn't even about her color. He told himself. It was about how she walked like she owned the place. Like she was better than him. He had tried to explain that to internal affairs during the preliminary interview. But the investigators' eyes were cold. They'd taken his badge, told him he was on administrative leave, said it would take some time to resolve. His lawyer, a man named Bennett Crane with slick hair and a polished jaw, arrived the next morning with a suitcase full of denials. You say nothing. You issue no statement. You let me handle the press. She's lying, Derek muttered. She set me up. She's a senator, Bennett said. She doesn't need to set anyone up. I was doing my job. You were doing something, the lawyer replied coolly. The camera footage doesn't look good. The language you used. Derek clenched his fists. She baited me. You don't get baited when you have power, Bennett said. You controlled the line. You crossed it. Outside, reporters circled like vultures. Inside, Derek sat with his palms sweating and his world crumbling. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. Celeste stood at the podium, her palms resting flat, her voice firm and clear. The Senate floor, usually half empty during midweek hearings, was packed. Journalists lined the walls. Behind her, fellow senators, some allies, some skeptics, watched closely. I want to speak not just as a lawmaker, but as a citizen, she began, as a daughter, as a survivor. Her voice never wavered. I was arrested for walking, for existing, for looking like someone a police officer believed did not belong. I was handcuffed, humiliated, not because of my actions, but because of assumptions born from skin. A hush fell over the chamber. My father died with bruises on his ribs because no one believed he belonged in a grocery store after dark. My mother still flinches when she sees a patrol car. And now, after all my education, all my work, all my effort to serve this country, I was reminded that no amount of achievement can erase the bias others hold against me. A pause. I am not here to ask for sympathy. I am here to demand accountability. Some stood, some stayed seated, but every camera captured her face, strong, tearless, commanding. The video of her speech went viral within the hour. One by one, survivors of similar abuses began to post their stories under hashtag silence is no longer an option. A high school student from Missouri, a retired veteran in Florida, a nurse from Milwaukee. Each had a story. Each had felt powerless. Celeste's voice gave them strength. The call came at midnight. Tasha answered first, bleary-eyed, and passed the phone to Celeste with trembling fingers. It's the prosecutor's office, she whispered. Celeste took the phone, heart pounding. They spoke in measured tones. Legal jargon, bureaucratic caution. Then came the words she feared. No charges at this time. On what grounds? She demanded. Insufficient evidence of criminal intent. But the footage shows an officer following procedure. Albeit harshly. The language was inappropriate, yes, but protected under qualified immunity. Celeste sat in silence for a long time after hanging up. The next morning, the headlines declared, Officer Klein cleared of criminal wrongdoing. Protests erupted again, this time louder, angrier. The people had been willing to wait for justice. Now they realized justice was not coming, at least not through traditional channels. Celeste stared at the TV screen, jaw clenched. Her mother called to comfort her. Her colleagues sent messages of support. But it all felt hollow. She walked to her mirror, looked at her reflection. If the system won't act, she whispered, I will. Celeste hadn't slept. By dawn, she had sent a flurry of encrypted messages to her closest aides, a few trusted journalists, and the legal minds she had met over the years, the ones who believed in structural change. Not symbolic gestures, If the official prosecutors refused to act, then she would construct a case of her own, brick by brick, until the walls of silence fell. At 8 a.m., her office door opened. Alana Ortega, a former federal investigator turned private consultant, stepped in wearing jeans and a leather jacket, holding a stack of documents in her hand and a grim look on her face. "I've reviewed the internal report," she said, dropping the papers on Celeste's desk. "They're sitting on damning evidence. Bodycam footage from Klein's prior stops, complaint records, even an internal memo suggesting he was a disciplinary risk. They buried it." Celeste leaned forward, her fingers steepled. "Can we prove that? We can do more than that," Alana said. "I've seen enough to file a civil rights lawsuit, and maybe light a fire under the Department of Justice while we're at it." Within the hour, Celeste convened a strategy meeting. The air buzzed with urgency. Tasha coordinated press liaisons. A young data analyst named Reggie compiled statistics on Klein's previous arrests, an overwhelming number of Black and Latino men and women. There was a pattern, and patterns held power. But Celeste understood the risk. Taking legal action outside official channels would invite attacks, both political and personal. Her colleagues would whisper that she was using her pain for ambition. The police union would come for her with a vengeance. And yet, she felt more certain than she had in years. The law had been weaponized against her. Now she would wield it back. Outside her window, the protests still echoed. Inside, she was building something far more dangerous to the system than fury, an organized, deliberate, relentless pursuit of truth. The sun was low over the skyline of Baltimore as Celeste pulled into her mother's driveway. The narrow row house stood stubborn against time. Its chipped bricks and aging shutters weathered but still intact, just like the woman inside. Her mother was already waiting at the door. "I saw the news," she said as Celeste stepped inside. "I'm going to sue him," Celeste said, "and I'm going after the department." The older woman didn't reply immediately. She poured 2 cups of coffee, both black, and sat at the old table in the kitchen, across from the daughter who had inherited her fire. "You remember when they brought your father home?" she asked, her voice low. Celeste nodded. "He couldn't walk for a week. They never charged him. He never raised his voice. Never raised a hand. They still called him a threat. Just like you." Her mother's hand trembled slightly as she held the cup. "You know they'll come for you now. Not just the cop. The whole damn machine." "I'm not afraid of them," Celeste said. "You should be. But do it anyway." They sat in silence for a while, the ghosts of the past moving quietly between the spaces. Later that night, Celeste wandered through her childhood bedroom. On the wall still hung her debate trophies, her acceptance letter to Harvard Law, a photograph of her and her father at the city courthouse the day she won her first case. He had worn his best suit. He had cried in the back row. She had buried him a year later, after a heart attack no one saw coming but everyone believed was tied to years of silent rage. Celeste closed her eyes and whispered to the air, "I'm going to finish what you started." The Senate Judiciary Committee room was overflowing, not just with senators and staffers but with press, advocates, and everyday citizens who had fought to get a seat in the back rows. C-SPAN cameras rolled, and live streams across the country buzzed to life. Celeste sat at the witness table, not as a senator this time, but as a private citizen testifying before Congress. The irony wasn't lost on her. Chairman Dawkins, a gruff moderate from Ohio, adjusted his microphone. "We are here today to examine the issue of racial profiling and excessive force in law enforcement. Senator Monroe, thank you for being here." Celeste's voice was steady. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "I was detained for walking home. I was handcuffed without cause. I was insulted, restrained, and ignored, not because of any act of mine, but because of the body I was born into. This isn't just my story. It's the story of too many Americans who are never given the benefit of the doubt. The story of a system that assumes guilt based on melanin." She turned to the room. "We need oversight. We need transparency. And we need accountability that doesn't wait until someone has a title or a camera to matter." The first panel after her was composed of victims. A high school teacher from North Carolina who had been tased at a traffic stop. A mother whose son was shot during a mental health crisis. A decorated veteran who had been stopped 5 times in 1 year simply for driving through affluent neighborhoods. Their voices were raw, trembling, but undeniable. Afterward, A senator from Texas tried to push back. Senator Monroe, isn't it possible Officer Klein was simply doing his job under difficult circumstances? Celeste's eyes narrowed. If doing his job means ignoring constitutional rights, then the job is broken, and we have a duty to fix it. The chamber erupted in murmurs and applause. That night, clips from her testimony flooded every major outlet. Her name, once whispered in corridors of power, now echoed in the streets. The movement had a face. The people had a voice. And the system had been put on notice. The moon was high, silver slicing through the clouds like judgment. Celeste sat on the edge of her hotel bed, still wearing the dark navy suit from her testimony. Her phone buzzed endlessly, messages of support, hate mail, death threats, all part of the same storm. She scrolled through the latest email alerts. One message from the Department of Justice caught her eye. It was carefully worded. We are reviewing materials related to the incident involving Senator Celeste Monroe and Officer Derek Klein. A federal inquiry may be initiated pending further developments. It wasn't confirmation, but it wasn't silence. She exhaled. Tasha knocked on her door minutes later. Her expression was tense. There was an accident, she said. What kind of accident? One of our junior legal aides, Marcus. His car was run off the road. He's alive, but shaken. Celeste's breath caught in her throat. Was it random? No one knows. But he'd been working on compiling the misconduct records. They looked at each other. No words were needed. The message was clear. Celeste walked to the window. Below, protesters were still marching, chanting, holding her name like a banner. She whispered to herself, "You scared now?" She thought about her father. About every hand that had been twisted into cuffs. Every name that had been forgotten. Every life that had been labeled suspicious for no reason other than color. She clenched her fists. No, I'm not scared. I'm awake. And she knew, this was only the beginning. The following week was a blur of interviews, strategy meetings, and rapidly shifting political winds. Celeste barely slept, barely ate. She had become a symbol. But she remained determined to be more than that. Symbols could be ignored. Leaders could not. Alana arrived at Celeste's office with a USB drive and eyes bloodshot from working 3 nights straight. I found something, she said, not even sitting down before plugging the device into the monitor. The video began with grainy footage from an unlisted police dashboard camera. A routine traffic stop. Derek Klein stepping out of his vehicle, hand on his holster, walking toward a black man in a beat-up sedan. This was 3 years ago. Alana said. The man's name is Michael Trenum. He was pulled over for a broken taillight. He ended up face down on the pavement with a concussion and 4 cracked ribs. Celeste leaned closer. Now watch this. Klein's voice came through, calm but filled with menace. Step out of the vehicle. Now. I'm just reaching for my registration, the man began. I said out. Now. The sound of a struggle. A crash. A grunt of pain. Then silence. Alana clicked over to another file. Here's the report Klein filed. Claims the suspect was aggressive. Claims there was a weapon in the glove compartment. There wasn't? Celeste asked. Nope. No weapon. No charges ever filed. The report was quietly sealed after an internal review. How many more of these do you have? Alana swallowed. At least 7. Celeste leaned back, fury rising in her throat like bile. They knew, she whispered. They always knew. That night, she called a press conference. Her team begged her to wait, to package the information more strategically. She refused. I'm not managing optics, she said. I'm exposing rot. In front of a sea of reporters. She played the video. One by one, she named each victim, each suppressed complaint, each falsified report. This isn't a bad apple, she said, her voice ringing across the city. This is a poisoned orchard. And the people who let it grow are just as guilty. The following morning, the city erupted. 2 days after Celeste's explosive press conference, Senator Jonathan Mallory from Georgia held an emergency press briefing of his own. A staunch conservative and longtime supporter of law enforcement, Mallory's tone was less composed than usual. His skin visibly flushed as he faced the cameras. We must not allow personal vendettas to undermine the institutions that protect our communities, he said. Senator Monroe's crusade, while emotionally compelling, sets a dangerous precedent, where officers are tried in the court of public opinion before evidence can be reviewed objectively. It was a direct shot. The first of many. Within hours, talking heads picked it up and spun it into fury. Right-wing media outlets branded Celeste a race baiter, a radical leftist, and, in some corners, even a domestic terrorist for law enforcement. Old clips from her university days, her participating in student protests, defending reparations, were dredged up and repackaged as proof of her militant agenda. The smear campaign came fast and loud. Celeste's inbox was flooded with death threats. Her staff had to sweep the office twice for security breaches. Her mother was relocated temporarily after someone posted her address online. Tasha had to talk down a terrified intern who received a voicemail saying, "We know where you work." The attacks weren't just verbal. Political allies began to back away. A few senators quietly withdrew their co-sponsorship of her pending police oversight bill. One even told her in confidence, "You're radioactive right now." Celeste understood, and she didn't care. She walked through the Capitol that day wearing a tailored navy suit. Her chin held high, her security doubled. At the Senate cafeteria, conversations paused when she entered. Eyes followed her, some with admiration, others with fear, others with hate. She smiled anyway. Later that evening, she gave an interview on national television. "When you shine a light into a dark room, the roaches scatter, but you don't turn off the light just because they scream," she said. "You keep it on. You burn brighter." That quote made the front page of the Washington Post the next morning. They gathered in the grand jury room on a rainy Monday morning. Their faces drawn, eyes cast downward as they were led through the process. The evidence was presented, methodically, relentlessly, by a special prosecutor who had been appointed after overwhelming public pressure. Celeste was not in the room. She waited in her office, pacing the floor, phone in hand. Hours passed. Then the call came. Tasha answered, froze, and handed it to Celeste without a word. "This is Special Counsel Eric Levin," the voice said. "The grand jury has returned an indictment against Officer Derek Klein on multiple counts: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault." Celeste sat down slowly. "You got him," Levin added. "It's not everything, but it's something, and it's public." She thanked him, then hung up and stared at the floor. Not speaking. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. By the time she stepped outside the Capitol steps, reporters had already gathered, somehow sensing what had happened. She faced the cameras with fire in her voice. "This isn't just about Derek Klein. It's about every officer who thought their badge made them untouchable. It's about every superior who looked the other way. Every politician who accepted union donations and shrugged off misconduct. Today's indictment is the first brick in a wall of justice that should have been built decades ago." That evening, Derek Klein was taken into custody. His mugshot was plastered across every screen in America. He looked nothing like the confident man who had slammed her against his cruiser weeks earlier. He looked like someone who had finally begun to understand consequences. The victory, as always, came at a cost. A week after the indictment, one of Celeste's closest aides, Elijah Washington, a brilliant young legal scholar helping compile the full misconduct database, was found beaten and unconscious in a parking garage 2 blocks from his apartment. His laptop was gone. His files were missing. The doctors said he might never regain full memory. Celeste sat beside his hospital bed, hand on the rail, unable to speak. Tasha entered the room with red-rimmed eyes and a silent phone, trembling in her hand. "There was no camera footage," she said. "Police think it was a mugging." Celeste didn't believe that for a second. That night, she called a private meeting with her inner circle. "No phones, no recordings. They've decided to fight dirty," she said. "So we fight smarter." Alana tapped the table. "We need to lock down the rest of the files. Cloud backup, triple encryption, no more physical drives. And we need someone to testify publicly." Celeste raised her hand. "I'll do it." "Celeste," Tasha began. "No, they've already made me a target. That won't change. But now we have something they fear even more: the truth. In daylight, spoken by someone they can't silence." There was silence around the table. Then nods. That weekend, Celeste stood on a stage in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the same place where Martin Luther King Jr. once dreamed aloud. Thousands of people stood below her, holding signs, candles, their faces turned toward her like sunflowers toward light. She spoke for an hour. She named names, shared facts, called for action. And when she was done, the crowd didn't chant her name. They chanted one word: justice. And justice, now, was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The courthouse was surrounded before sunrise. Barricades lined the street. Reporters in rain gear jostled for position under gray skies. Protesters waved placards demanding justice. On the opposite corner, a smaller cluster of counter-protesters waved thin blue-line flags and shouted into megaphones. There were chants and drumbeats and camera flashes. But within the glass walls of the building, a tense and reverent silence fell. Inside, the air was heavy with expectation. Celeste sat in the witness room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a black suit with a single gold pin on her collar. The one her father had given her the day she passed the bar. It was shaped like a scale, unbalanced. Deliberately so. "That's what you're here to fix," he had said. The door opened and Special Counsel Levin entered, a folder tucked under his arm. "They've finished jury selection," he said. "We go in 20. Celeste nodded. Her pulse was a steady drumbeat in her ears. But her gaze was still and clear. In the courtroom, the trial of Derek Klein began. From the outset, it was not just about her. The prosecution laid out the pattern, the long line of abuses. The redacted reports. The victims who never received apologies or hearings or headlines. Celeste was the star witness. Yes, but the case was a chorus, not a solo. When she finally took the stand, the room hushed. She looked directly at the jury and spoke. Not with practiced legalese, but with unflinching truth. "He looked at me and didn't see a senator," she said. "He saw a threat. He saw someone unworthy of respect or rights. He saw my skin and made a decision that nearly ended my career. My safety. My freedom. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to see me." The defense tried to paint her as an opportunist, a radical, a politician with a vendetta. But every time they jabbed, she responded with clarity, composure, and facts. And the facts did not lie. The most damning moment came when the jury was shown body cam footage, previously unreleased, of Klein muttering to a fellow officer. "They always cry foul. You just gotta show them who's in charge before they get ideas." It wasn't just cruel, it was philosophy. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired for deliberation. The nation held its breath. 22 hours later, the verdict was read. On count 1, guilty. On count 2, guilty. On count 3, guilty. In the gallery, gasps gave way to tears. Outside, the crowd erupted. Celeste did not smile. She bowed her head, eyes closed, as if in prayer. Not for revenge, but for peace. 3 weeks after the verdict, the sentencing hearing was scheduled. Klein stood in a gray suit. Thinner now, pale, his eyes sunken and defiant. His lawyer had pleaded for leniency, citing his years of service and lack of prior convictions. He apologized, but only in the vaguest terms, calling his actions misjudgments and referring to Celeste only once, and never by name. Celeste sat quietly, listening. When the judge finally invited her to speak, she rose and walked to the center of the room. "I did not ask to be here," she began. "I did not choose to become a face of anything. But I will not waste this moment." She turned toward Klein, but her voice spoke to more than him. "You stole something from me. Not just dignity, but the comfort of walking freely in my own country. And you stole from others, those you stopped, beat, cursed, silenced. You thought your badge was a shield. But it became a mirror. And in that mirror, this country saw itself." She paused. "I don't hate you. I don't need to. What I need, what we all need, is to believe this will never happen again. And that begins with accountability." The judge, an older black woman with a reputation for blunt integrity, sentenced Klein to 10 years in federal prison, citing his abuse of power and calculated disregard for constitutional rights. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a long, heavy silence. And then, slowly, people began to rise, one by one, not in protest or joy, but in solemn recognition. Something had shifted. In the weeks following the trial, Celeste's name appeared in every newspaper, every talk show, every school debate. But it wasn't just the name. It was what it stood for. Justice. Real, messy, hard-fought justice. A group of civil rights leaders drafted the Celeste Monroe Civil Liberties Act, aimed at national police accountability reform. The legislation included mandatory body cam use, independent misconduct review boards, and federal funding tied to civil rights compliance. It passed the House with thunderous support. In the Senate, the vote was close. Celeste watched from the gallery, her heart pounding as the final votes came in. 52 to 48. The bill passed. Across the country, reform bills began appearing at the state level. Police departments were forced to reckon with their policies. Citizens began to file complaints with the knowledge they might finally be heard. At a community college in North Carolina, a student-led initiative created a scholarship in her name. At a high school in Oakland, students performed a stage adaptation of her testimony. At a church in Detroit, a mural was painted, Celeste standing tall, half in shadow, half in light, the words, "We see you," glowing above her. And yet, Celeste remained grounded. She returned to her old neighborhood in Baltimore, walking the streets with no security detail. She met with activists, mothers of victims, public defenders. She listened more than she spoke. One evening, she stood at her father's grave. "They know my name now. Daddy," she whispered, "but I never wanted fame. I wanted justice. For you, for me, for all of us." A breeze stirred the trees above. "I did it," she said, tears in her voice, "and I'm not done." Years passed. The world moved on in ways both profound and frustrating. New headlines, new protests, new struggles. But something had changed. Celeste Monroe had become not just a senator, but a stateswoman. Her speeches were studied, her policies cited, her courage taught in classrooms. She no longer had to raise her voice to be heard. Her silence was its own warning. She had married quietly, adopted 2 children, wrote a memoir that spent 34 weeks on the bestseller list. Yet she never forgot. One fall morning, she returned to the Capitol to speak at a ceremony commemorating the passage of a second reform package. She wore a dark coat and a scarf her mother had knitted. The rotunda was packed. Members of Congress, judges, families of the fallen. She stepped to the podium. "I was once told that justice wears a blindfold. But I've lived long enough to know she also needs a spine. And a voice." She smiled, not with triumph, but with purpose. Justice has no color, no party, no name. It is not a prize to be won or a privilege to be inherited. It is a promise, and it's time we all keep it. As the room rose to its feet, Celeste looked out over the crowd, not with pride, but with resolve. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of theirs.